Soon, Escobar's operation was responsible for smuggling several tons of cocaine into America and Europe every week, resulting in profits of as much as $60 million a day and upwards of $20 billion annually. Consequently, operations expanded beyond Colombia, and by the early 1980s, the cartel was acquiring coca paste from plantations which were established in neighboring countries, such as Peru and Bolivia. The operation had created an industry throughout South America. The cartel was now generating so much money that it could not be spent, and even the acts of laundering it and hiding it had become highly problematic. Much of it was laundered through Panama, often by buying gold and then melting it down into forms which could then be converted into clean money in other countries. But even these methods had their limitations, and so, instead of spending the money, huge tranches of it were hidden in properties across the country, where few would suspect it of being located. Also, incredibly, the cartel acquired a mansion in which a retractable jacuzzi was installed. This had a secret compartment underneath it, in which tens of millions of dollars were stored. A poor Colombian family were then given the house to live in, without being told about the compartment, the only catch being that they had to occasionally leave the premises whenever money was taken from the compartment or added to it. Unsurprisingly, some of this money is still being found today. In 2020, Nicolás Escobar, Pablo's nephew, found $18 million hidden in the wall of one of Pablo's former residences. It is far from the only time that huge sums of money have been discovered inadvertently in some of Escobar's and the cartel's former properties. With ever-increasing profits, there also came an ever greater risk of getting caught. One of the greatest fears for Escobar and other members of the cartel was extradition. In September 1979, the Colombian government had signed an extradition treaty with the administration of U.S. President Jimmy Carter, whereby Colombian drug smugglers who imported large quantities of cocaine into the United States could be sent to the U.S. to face criminal prosecution for their crimes there. This treaty came into effect in March 1982 and posed a grave risk to Escobar. If he were arrested and sentenced in Colombia, the corruption which prevailed in the country would allow him to either escape conviction or a jail sentence would follow under very comfortable terms. However, if he was extradited to the United States and was convicted there, he would almost certainly face life in prison in a maximum security facility. In response to this threat in the early to mid-1980s, Escobar and several associates began a terrorist campaign of kidnappings, murders and bombings of individuals within Colombian politics, policing and the judiciary in an attempt to make them row back on the extradition treaty. But it did not have the desired effect, and throughout the 1980s, the fear of extradition remained omnipresent for traffickers such as Escobar in Colombia. To counteract the risk of extradition, Pablo attempted to gain popular support throughout Colombia. Much of Escobar's mystique was born of a self-created image of himself as a Colombian Robin Hood. In the initial years, there was a perception that Pablo and the cartel's activities were doing little to harm ordinary Colombians. Any social damage which their actions engendered occurred far away in the United States, a country which many Colombians viewed as an imperial aggressor in Latin America. To soften his image further, Pablo gave away substantial amounts of the vast sums of money which were arriving into the cartel's coffers every week. This he distributed as free cash giveaways to the people of Medellin in some instances, while he also spent large sums of money on building projects, both in Medellin and the wider country. These included soccer stadiums, parks and civic amenities, while for a time he even opened the zoo at Hacienda Nápoles to the public, charging no entry fee. One of the most significant investments was in improving the road network around Medellin. The city had developed very quickly in the 20th century and was now plagued by traffic jams, which Pablo's money went some way towards remedying. Finally, at Christmas, Escobar dressed as Santa Claus and would give out expensive presents in the poorer neighborhoods. In this way, he bought the adulation of many of Medellin's and wider Colombia's citizens. Despite such efforts to soften his image, by the early 1980s, Pablo was well known as the head of the infamous Medellin cartel and was a marked man. So he responded in a novel way. He courted even further notoriety. In 1982, he decided to enter Colombian politics and stood as a candidate for the Colombian Liberal Party. Here he focused his campaigning on the extradition treaty, which was just coming into effect between Colombia and the United States, with Pablo arguing that the Colombian president, Julio César Turbay, was effectively ceding away some of Colombia's sovereignty to the United States by allowing Washington to extradite Colombian citizens to its own country and prosecute them there. Yet Pablo had his own critics throughout the campaign as well, some of whom were silenced with bullets. At a debate in Medellin, one vocal dissenter accused Escobar of entering politics for his own ends. The man was detained by the Medellin police shortly afterwards, elements of which were in the cartel's employ. Thereafter, he was handed over to Escobar's henchmen before showing up days later, dead on the streets of Medellin, his body riddled with bullets. Thus, through a mixture of intimidation and his populism, Escobar managed to win election to the Colombian Chamber of Representatives in March 1982. Pablo's entry into Colombian politics was a debatable strategy. While it provided something of a smokescreen for his illicit activities and allowed him to challenge the extradition treaty from within Parliament, it generated an awful lot of unnecessary attention for him. More significantly, it provoked the conservative political establishment in Colombia to begin attempting to bring him down. Before, he had been one of many drug traffickers in the country, albeit the most successful. Now he was deliberately trying to undermine the country's political establishment. In particular, the newly elected conservative president, Belisario Betancourt, was determined to oust Escobar from Colombia's politics. To that end, in the summer of 1983, Betancourt initiated a campaign against Pablo. Firstly, he appointed Rodrigo Lara Bonilla as the Minister of Justice to take a much more active stance in prosecuting Colombia's drug traffickers, Pablo being chief amongst